Hello and welcome to this tutorial showing you how to build your miniAtmegatron. You should receive a silver packet like this that contains the PCB, the components and the instructions. You're going to need some cutters, a soldering iron and some solder, and possibly some braid as well, possibly a solder sucker. So first off, get the instructions, open them up, and you're basically going to take the PCB and work through the components, starting with the top left component and then going down each column. So the first, do all the components in the first column, then the second, then the third, then the fourth. So I'm starting off here with the first resistor, and you'll see that I show you exactly which colour is which, the bands on the resistor. Be very careful to make sure you get the right resistor in the right holes, that's quite important. What I do is I push a few through at a time and then solder them in and then cut the ends off and then move on to a few more resistors. So I'll just fast forward through this until all the resistors are done. So that's all the resistors done, or so I thought at the time. In fact, you can see there's a few left and I finished those off in a few minutes. So once the resistors are all done, we move on to the capacitors. And there's 3 blue capacitors. There's 2 561s and 1 272 capacitor. It's really important to get these the right way around. The writing on them is really faint, so you'll see I pick it up and then have a good look at it and then make sure it's the right one and then put it in the hole. And I do that for all 3 of the blue ones, and obviously the brownie coloured one is pretty easy to get in the right place. And then the last capacitor is the tantalum capacitor, which is polarised. So you can see I look carefully at which is the positive leg, which is always the longer leg, and then make sure I align the positive leg with the positive symbol on the PCB, and then solder it in the usual way. So next up is the MCP 6002, which is an op amp. The only thing to say about this is that you need to get the notch on the chip aligned with the notch on the PCB. This actually means that it looks like the writing's upside down, but don't worry, that is the correct way around for this chip to go. It should stay in by itself when you turn it upside down, or you can hold your finger on it just to keep it still and then solder it in. Next is the 3.5mm mono jack output. Just make sure it's nice and flat when you're soldering it in. Next are the 6 potentiometers. They should all slot through nice and easily into the 6 positions on the PCB. They're all the same potentiometer, so any one can go in any slot. They should hold in with friction alone. You can pull the pins, the retaining clips, apart slightly if they're not. When you flip it upside down, make sure all the pots are nice and straight. This is so that should you want to buy the enclosure, once it's been made available, all the pots will pop through the holes in the enclosure nice and easily. Now solder in the retaining clips. Be nice and generous with the solder on this. It's worth mentioning that with RV1, which is the play and pitch potentiometer, the retaining clips can touch the USB of your Arduino Uno. If it does do this, clip the retaining clip right back so it doesn't, because it would not be good if it does. I haven't done it in this video, but I frequently do at the end of assembling it. So this is the point that I realised that I'd missed a load of resistors out, so I quickly go back and put those ones in. Next up are the push buttons, and just like the potentiometers, they stay in with friction alone. And again, just like the potentiometers, make sure they're nice and straight when you solder them in, so that should you want an enclosure at a later date, they will pop through the holes of the enclosure without any problems. And next is the switch, and again that just slots in and will stay in with friction, and again make sure it's nice and straight and all the way in before you solder in the 3 pins. They're quite close together, those 3 pins, but it shouldn't be too tricky to make sure that you don't bridge the solder joints. And now comes the only really tricky step of the entire thing. This is the LEDs. First job is to make sure you work out which is the flat side and put it in the right way so that the flat side of the LED matches the flat symbol on the PCB. Carefully slot those through. Keep the legs really straight. Hold it in place because you don't want it half out when you solder it in. Put tiny blobs of solder on each leg. You may find it helps to do just a couple of legs and then snip them, and then a couple more legs and snip them. And then usually after you've soldered them, you have to then just heat up the pad again just to make sure that the solder's nicely gone into the pad. You may find a magnifying glass helps. The main thing is not to use too much solder and just to take your time and to be really careful. You'll see in the instructions that I say use a point-nosed tip to your soldering iron. Definitely don't use a flat-nosed tip. And the finer the point, the better really for this job. So at this point I realised that I've bridged 2 of the pads on the LED. This is very easy to do, and I certainly don't claim to be the world's best solderer. So I get the braid out, and then it's always a good idea to actually add solder to your soldering iron when you using braid. It helps the flow into the braid, and then heat up the pad nice and warm, and then the solder will seep away. And you may even find that there's enough solder left even once you've used the braid, that just to hold it in place. I think I'm then just heating up the pads again there just to get the solder flowing where it's left and making sure there's nothing bridging the pins. So the final step is to put the header pins in to the Arduino. And the way I always do this is a bit controversial. I put the pins in to the Arduino and then solder it with it in place. That way I know that the thing's going to be perfectly vertical and it will slot in without any problems. The one thing I'd say is if you do this, don't hold the soldering iron on each pin for too long. The last thing you want is the thing melting the plastic header of the Arduino. Also, don't have your soldering iron on too hot. And again, I've bridged a couple of points there, so I've got the braid out and I've just removed the solder, and now there's no join between those. It's important to make sure there aren't any bridges between any of those pins. So there you go, the thing is complete in just over half an hour. Give it a quick check over for missing solder joints or bridge solder joints, because it's better to find that out now rather than having to debug it later on. Now, if you bought a MIDI hacked Arduino with your miniAtmegatron, it's very easy. All you have to do is plug in the USB, plug in a mini jack, away you go. If you just bought the shield, you'll need to install the miniAtmegatron source code. So go to the Arduino website and download the Arduino software. You can find a link on the Salisbury Synths website. Download that and install it. And once it's finished installing, run it up once. And this creates all the necessary folders for you to install the miniAtmegatron source code. And then once it's run up, just close it down again. Then go back to the Salisbury Synths miniAtmegatron downloads page and download the libraries zip and download the miniAtmegatron source code zip. Once they've downloaded, expand both of them. And then take the contents of the libraries folder, then find your Documents Arduino libraries folder and copy those folders in. Be really careful to make sure you don't end up with a libraries folder within your libraries folder. The structure should go Documents, Arduino, Libraries, and there's all your folders. And then copy the miniAtmegatron source code folder to your Documents Arduino folder. So the structure is ssmin miniAtmegatron. And then within that you'll find your Arduino sketch, double click it and the software will run up. Then connect the USB of your Arduino Uno. Then go to Tools and Board and make sure that Arduino Uno is selected. Then go to Tools and Port and make sure that the COM port of your Arduino is selected. Then click the Upload icon, which is in the top left hand corner, and the second icon along. Wait 30 seconds and it's all complete. So that's the complete assembly process for the miniAtmegatron.